We are so lucky, Bill. We continue to get such incredibly high caliber folks on this podcast. And man, I just learn something every time. And we just get to hear cool stories and talk to cool people. And we did yet another one. Tell us who we had today.
Today we had Dr. Mike Brasher, and he is he's a waterfowl scientist and works for Ducks Unlimited, and he's been there for 17 years now, and his whole life has been devoted to ducks and the study of ducks. So we've had duck hunters on, but today we had a guy who he knows the ins and outs of ducks, and we got a lot of really positive news for the first time in a few years.
Yeah, after we had the B-pop, which I love that acronym, not to be confused with K-pop, as I mentioned on the podcast. But what's that B-pop?
Well, the B-pop is basically the breeding population survey that is flown every spring, and it's the northern U.S. prairies, it's the Great Lakes, it's the Canadian prairies, it's the boreal forest, and basically everywhere waterfowl breed in North America, they try to fly these transects and get a count of the birds, the number of ponds, some habitat information, and that's how we set our seasons. So what they counted this year, and all the information will be out in August, but now we have a lot of the reports just basically coming back from the pilots. And this is what will be used to set next year's season. So what we see in August will tell you whether or not you'll have a liberal or a moderate season in 23-24.
Yeah, so all you waterfowlers, ears up. This is the first little sneak preview into what this year's count's going to look like, and he gave us some prognostications a little bit, not final numbers by any means, but definitely a little bit of an idea. So enjoy this one. Dr. Mike Brasher from Ducks Unlimited.
Since 1936, the National Wildlife Federation has worked with hunters and anglers to pass the most important conservation laws of American history and to protect our sporting traditions. This podcast explores our history, our values, and the work we do to safeguard the fish and wildlife that fuel our passions. We are NWF Outdoors.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to the NWF Outdoors podcast. This is your host, Aaron Kindle, with my good buddy and co-host, Bill Cooksey. What's happening today, Bill?
Hey, Aaron, all good. It's about 106 here in Tennessee today, but we're going to cool down the end of this week. My house will be 80 by the time the sun goes down tonight.
Whew. You got to have some thick skin or thin skin or whatever you call it for that, because I wouldn't be able to handle that. We got monsoons coming in full in Colorado. It rains every afternoon right now. Cools it down to about 72 degrees, and then the evenings are just heavenly. Get down to mid 50s and stay nice and cool. So we're good, but let's jump over to our guest today. I'm going to let you introduce him. You're the waterfowl man, and this is something we've been wanting to talk about for a while, because there's a survey hasn't been done the last 2-3 years because of COVID, and it's a critical survey, and that's, I know, one of the big things we want to talk about. But I'll turn it over to you to introduce our guest today.
That's great. Yeah, I'm excited about this guest. We've had some big duck hunters on here, like Jim Ronquist and Gary Mason and several others, and guys who really know ducks. But this guy really knows ducks. I mean, he's spent his life studying waterfowl, and actually has the title to go with it. Today we have Dr. Mike Brasher. He is a waterfowl scientist at Ducks Unlimited. He's been there as a waterfowl scientist for, I think, 3 years. And before that, he spent about, he'll correct me, but 17 years, I think, as the Gulf Coast Joint Venture Biological Team Leader, which is cool to me because he knows a lot of the stuff that Vanishing Paradise is supporting down in coastal Louisiana. So we won't get into all that, but Mike knows ducks. And today we're going to talk about the B-pop, which is basically the count that sets future seasons, and it's something that hasn't been done in 2 years. So, Mike, welcome to the show, and tell us a little bit more about yourself. That was pretty dry from my end.
No, it's all good, Bill. Thanks so much for the invitation, for the opportunity to be here. And Aaron, nice to see you, and appreciate being part of this. I will kind of go back and say, Aaron, you you mentioned something about the heat down here and not exactly sure what it takes to withstand all that. I tell you, the number one thing that you have to have is a properly functioning air conditioner. If you don't have, if you don't have that, you're going to be in trouble. And even having that throughout the summer, these hot summers can be a bit of a challenge. We've had some problems with ours here over the past few months, but all working well now. So that's an absolute necessity. And yeah, Bill, it's appreciate your introduction. In terms of how long I've been with DU, what I do right now, and where I've been over my career, I've been with DU in total for 17 years. Let me do the math. Yeah, 17 years. That's the 17-year number. I was down there on the Gulf Coast, stationed in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is a great place to be, as you well know, having spent time down there on the coast for I was there for, I guess it's going to be 13 and a half years. And my wife and I moved up here to Memphis in summer of 2019. And the new position that we have here at national headquarters, waterfowl scientist. I report directly to our chief scientist. A lot of your listeners, I should say, might be familiar with Ducks Unlimited's previous chief scientist, Dr. Tom Moorman. He longtime waterfowl scientist here in the South. He was my supervisor for most of my time as a DU employee. And now I still report to our chief scientist, but that's Dr. Steve Adair. He moved into that position a couple of years ago. And so, yeah, grew up in North Mississippi, here in Memphis, not too far from where I grew up, where I learned to duck hunt, where I became who I am and developed my interest, and went to school at Mississippi State for a couple of degrees, on to Ohio State for a few years, and then moved down to Lafayette and the Gulf Coast Joint Venture. First day on the job there was 2 weeks before Hurricane Katrina made landfall. So
wow,
I was there for all of that stuff that has happened since 2005.
But Mike, we normally start off, and before we get too far into the subject today, we talk about what we've been doing outside. So what lately have you done outside?
That's a good question. Travel has started to pick up for me a little bit here in this position. As waterfowl scientist for DU, one of my responsibilities is to represent Ducks Unlimited in a variety of sort of professional societies and conferences, representing our science and some of the work that we do. And so that requires me to travel a fair bit. So much of the past few weeks has been associated with travel. We can go all the way back to Ducks Unlimited Expo. I forget what month that was. That was there in Dallas, Fort Worth. I went to the state convention down in Louisiana to give a little talk down there about some of the work that we were doing. Here recently, I was at a ornithological conference in Puerto Rico, and then 2 weeks ago was down in New Orleans for our national convention. So it's been a lot of travel. I have not done a lot of sort of personal recreation this summer locally. Seems like the spare time that I have away from traveling is spent keeping things up around our house. We have 16 acres there just east of Memphis, and so we're trying to manage for some grassland bird habitat, pollinator habitat. And so I stay busy on my tractor and doing those types of things whenever I have some spare time. So that, and then otherwise just trying to stay cool, trying to keep those AC units running.
Watching the grass dry up and die.
That's right. That too, for sure.
Aaron, I hope you have something cool outside, because my report's going to sound a lot like Mike's.
Well, kind of, yeah. I mean, for us in Colorado, the summers are about getting into the high country because it doesn't last long up there. And we chase a lot of cutthroat trout and, try to get up there and stay cool. And my son and I backpack, 2-3 times a year, every year. My wife and daughter haven't backpacked as much in the previous years, but really wanted to get out this year. So we spent this past weekend in the wilderness in Colorado here, did a 3-night backpacking trip. Didn't see a soul, saw some fish, saw a mountain goat, saw a bull moose, a cow moose, and a calf moose all together, saw a couple hundred elk, a couple dozen deer, lots of marmots and pikas, and we were camped right about 11,000 feet and spent a lot of time above timberline and trying to stay away from getting struck by lightning quite often. By the time it gets afternoon and those storms roll in and you're way up there, you try to get out of that. So been doing a lot of that, and been doing a little shooting at the range with my kid. I got him a new gun for his birthday, and he took his first elk last year, and with my gun, which was a real fun sight in, last year, we went through a lot of rounds trying to figure it out. Just, you'd think if you look through the crosshairs and it's on the target, it's going to be good, but it's not true. It's got to be set for the shooter. So we got him his gun. He's shooting it awesome. So we've been getting out on the range and those kinds of things, and about to travel to Alaska actually for work. We're going to be in Sitka and Juneau. I always say that wrong. Talking to hunters and anglers, commercial fishermen and hunters about how climate is impacting Alaska. And so that'll be interesting. Look out for that for our listeners. We'll have some more on that, but be interested to talk to you a little bit, Mike, too. Anything you can say, climate wise with waterfowl. I know there's some huge impacts, and, maybe I'll ask you that a little bit later if we have some time. But anyway, that's it. Sorry, long rant.
Well, mine's easy. 2 weeks ago when we did the Return Act show, I was in a New Orleans hotel room, got home Saturday from that, did yard work. Then the following week I was at ICAST. Last week I was at ICAST in Orlando. And for fishing gearheads, man, that is a show. If you can find a way to get there and get in, it's cool. Plus you see all the pros, all the manufacturers, they're all there and they're all happy to talk to you. So it's, great for my work to get in there with those folks. But again, I got back on Saturday and spent the weekend doing yard work at the lake. So
we got to get you out of the inferno, Bill. You keep going to all these hot places. Go north, young man.
Now, here's the good thing. New Orleans and Orlando were both about 10 degrees cooler than Jackson, Tennessee.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Never would have thought.
And they had a breeze. So, yes, it was much more comfortable in the deep South than it was in the mid-South. But
Bill, we may have been in New Orleans at the same time.
We were.
That was my observation as well. We got real lucky with the weather down there that week. It was still hot and it was still humid, and all of our Canadian counterparts that came down there were just could not fathom how someone would be able to live in that type of environment. And those of us that are familiar with it said, well, we actually caught a little bit of a break this week because had some cloud cover and a breeze. It can be way worse.
Correct.
We've seen it and felt it.
Correct. And they live in a place where it gets so cold in the wintertime, their tires go flat on one side and they have to keep their trucks plugged in overnight so they'll start. So, it's kind of a wash in my opinion. But, a few weeks ago, we hadn't even mentioned this. Mike, you're one of the hosts of the DU Ducks Unlimited podcast. And driving home from New Orleans, I was listening to your podcast with a retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot who I had the pleasure of meeting in South Louisiana the November after Katrina. So about the same time you were getting started down there. And y'all were talking about BPOP because he was in the middle of flying it. So I thought, man, what a great opportunity to get someone who understands duck numbers and duck habitat and how all this stuff works together on the show to talk about it. So let's jump right in. And
can I interrupt? Not for a total diversion before we get started, but have you guys heard of K-pop? K-pop is like Korean pop music, and every time you say B-pop, I'm thinking, is this some sort of duck pop music or something? But I know it's not, but I can't get it out of my mind.
So when you ask me, what is B-pop? And I mean, you're an elk and deer hunter, so I get it.
Yeah, I don't know.
And plenty of duck hunters don't know what BPOP is either. So hopefully we can get that information out there. So what is BPOP? Correct. Not K-pop.
No, not
I don't know K-pop. So, but Mike, what is BPOP and why should duck hunters understand it?
Yeah. Well, BPOP, that's just the acronym that has developed over the years, shorthand for breeding population. And it's typically we say BPOP survey, meaning it's a breeding population survey. We'll get into kind of the formal names here, but Bill, I'll mention that guest that you heard me talking to was Fred Rutker, retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist, worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service for 30 years. His primary responsibility was to serve as a as an aviator, a pilot for a lot of the aerial survey work that the Fish and Wildlife Service does. And a lot of it revolves around waterfowl, surveying waterfowl habitats. He has a tremendous number of stories to tell and experiences. He's probably viewed and observed and set foot on and certainly set eyes on more waterfowl habitat across North America than 99.5% of all waterfowl hunters. It's just from the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico all the way to the Arctic North Slope.
Wow.
He's seen it all. And so some tremendous stories we got from Fred there. He was flying on contract this year with the service, partly because of some of the things that happened over the past few years when they had to take a hiatus from conducting that survey due to the pandemic. You potentially lose some institutional knowledge of the way things are done, and they're always trying to train new pilots and counters, observers. So that was one of the things that Fred was doing while he was on contract, is bringing back that 30 plus years of institutional knowledge of the survey, the transects, the locations, and all the logistics that go into it, to help train that future generation of pilots that's going to continue this survey. So with that sort of background, the BPOP survey, officially the title of that survey is the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. It goes by a lot of different names. The May survey, that's the same thing. A lot of hunters may have heard it called that. The duck survey, the pond counts.
May pond counts, yeah.
That's right. May pond counts all comes from that Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. The important thing to mention here is that, and I know we'll probably touch on this in other different ways, is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the primary operator of that survey, but they work hand in hand with the Canadian Wildlife Service. I'm not going to get all these numbers quite right, but the Canadian Wildlife Service offers up a couple of planes or a couple of pilots, I think. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service offers up, I think, 8 pilots and planes that they spread out across this vast landscape each spring. They also work very closely with the state agencies in those locations. Provincial agencies up in Canada play a large part in this, as well as some participation by a few NGO staff members. I think DU Canada offers up a couple of staff members every year to serve on some of these ground count teams. And I don't know how much detail we want to start to get into, but you can just kind of let me know. But it's a massive survey. It has been conducted formally since 1955, widely recognized as the largest, most comprehensive survey of a kind of continental wildlife resource anywhere on the planet. Let's see. I guess 2 years ago, we kind of had to put a pause to it. 2019, the survey was conducted. And then in 20 and 21, it was not conducted due to some travel restrictions, international travel restrictions. We can talk about the specifics of that if you want to. A lot of people I've seen picking on the Fish and Wildlife Service for not conducting the survey the past couple of years. It's not entirely their decision. Canadian Wildlife Service is the one that has to give them permission to fly into their airspace. So there's a lot that went into those decisions. And the good news, however, that survey was conducted in full this year for the first time since 2019. The Fish and Wildlife Service had conducted a few parts of the survey last year. I think in Alaska, they did some of the surveys. They did some of the surveys in the northeastern U.S., but they couldn't get into Canada last year. So that's sort of the high level view of that survey and where we are with it right now in terms of this year. But Bill, and Aaron, what else? What do y'all want to discuss there with regard to the specifics?
I'll give you a giant question to unpack, or maybe it's two or three, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One is, just let's lay out the mechanics of exactly what happens. How does it work? I know there's transects and some other stuff like, how big is it? Where do you fly? What are you looking for? Those kinds of things. And then the other things I'm just curious about, I think everybody's probably curious about, is just how are they doing? Which ones are struggling? Which ones are doing great? What have we learned? What did that gap mean for us? Is there some big things that jumped out because we had a 2-year gap? Things like that. I mean, just all of that's on my mind. I'll try to follow up as we're talking here, because I know that was too much at once, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I forget the statistics. I want to say that there are about 80,000 miles of transects flown each year on this survey. I think that's about right. And I forget the scale, like I don't how many billions of acres that it covers, and I don't know that that would necessarily resonate with in people's minds anyway. So what I'll do is just kind of paint a picture. If you have in your mind's eye North America as a continent, if you take the Great Lakes states, if you take the prairie states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, if you take pretty much all of the prairies of Canada, all of the boreal forest of Canada, and the northern portion of Canada, then various segments of Alaska, that entire landscape is part of this survey. It's a massive area. It's where, over 90% of our waterfowl, ducks and geese would breed in any given year. Not all of we've got a lot of those northern Arctic goose colonies. They aren't necessarily included in all of this in this survey, just for some logistical reasons. But it's a massive undertaking. There are also some state level surveys in California, Oregon, Washington that contribute to this. State level surveys in the Great Lakes states. The northeastern states conduct surveys that contribute to this. The vast majority of Canada falls within that survey region. And so, Aaron, you, with regard to the mechanics and what it looks like, you mentioned transects, and that's a word that we use to describe sort of the design of a survey. Our goal, I say I'll probably say our and there and those type of terms interchangeably. I say our sometimes in this because although Ducks Unlimited does not participate, other than just a couple of staff members for DU Canada in this survey, we consider it part of ours as a member of the waterfowl community. So forgive me if I say that, just know that's the context in which it is. But the goal for that survey is to generate not a total count. It's impossible to think that we could go out there, anybody could go out there and count every duck or every pair of ducks or geese. So what you have to do is implement some statistically rigorous survey design methods. And one of the most commonly implemented methods is something called a transect survey. It's where you established fixed lines on the landscape, traversing what you know to be important, in this case, breeding duck habitat. And you establish a method by which you fly those transects, in this case with planes, and then you count all the ducks, in this case, on each side of that transect within some distance of that transect and of that center line. And if you think about it, what you have effectively done is counted all of the ducks that you're observing within a small fraction of the landscape. I don't know what that fraction is. Maybe it's 0.5%, but you get a count from those transects and then you extrapolate it up to the entire survey area to which those transects are designed to be representative. And there's a whole lot of stuff to unpack from a statistical standpoint in some of the words that I mentioned there. Representativeness and what you identify as the important habitats. And there's different densities of transects across some of these strata based on the densities of waterfowl that you see there. It all goes back to statistical principles of design and estimation. Some of the same transects have been used since 1955. They've made some tweaks to some of the survey methodologies and analytical methods over the years, always looking to improve kind of what they're doing and how they're collecting that data. It's not a complete census, but it is the most statistically rigorous method of estimation for duck populations that is conceivable for such a large landscape.
And Mike, you just mentioned a word that I think was good to bring up, in that census, because a lot of duck hunters want to make this out to be a census, a total number of ducks, and obviously it's not. And one of the reasons is those fixed transects, and we know some years maybe the habitat is just a little better off of those transects. And I've heard biologists say, actually we think the ducks are in pretty good shape, but they're not where we fly. So can you explain why y'all keep that method and you're not trying to go find them and count them?
Well, there's different ways of trying to survey ducks. I think over this, and I'll try not to get too far off into an area that I'm not qualified to speak to, but because it probably could get into some statistical concepts. I will say, as a comparison, while the breeding population survey that we're talking about here uses the same transects year after year, there are some states that a lot of your listeners may be familiar with. Arkansas is an example that use a transect-based design for their midwinter waterfowl survey, but they use a method called resampling. They sample transects, these random locations of transects every year. And Bill, I'm kind of thinking on the fly here. One of the reasons why I think that approach would be more defensible in a place like, let's say, Arkansas than, let's say, on the breeding grounds is, number one, it's probably going to be related to resources that are available to conduct the survey. The other may be that on wintering grounds, perhaps that habitat is more variable from month to month and from year to year. So the other thing is that when we look to that breeding population survey, one of the key components one of the other key components that we get from it is a pond count. And if the basins don't move around. What does change is whether they're inundated or not. So if you're wanting to compare pond counts from year to year and recognizing that the basins themselves don't move, the only thing that changes is the water, probably the best design for that is going to be one where use the same transects year after year. And so therefore it's giving you the opportunity to count the same number of basins year after year. And you're just measuring variation in that precipitation. So yeah, you tempted me there to kind of get off in some of the specifics. And so I think I'm fairly on the mark with some of that, but there's different ways to do these surveys. A lot of time when we're talking about waterfowl surveys, and it all really starts with what's your objective. There are some states, what's your objective, and also what does that landscape look like? There's some locations, some states where if waterfowl habitats are very discrete, occur at very small scales, maybe it's river bottoms in western Tennessee. Those areas may be more conducive to what we call a cruise survey, where with a high degree of consistency where that waterfowl habitat is likely to be. And you can, with fairly reasonable effort, do a good job counting what you think is going to be the vast majority of that waterfowl habitat. Maybe that's good enough for the objective that a state might have for it. So a lot of things go into a decision on why an agency picks a certain design.
I'm not good at the waiting part, guys. I'm looking for the great reveal. I want to know what this thing told us. Like, I mean, we could build it up here until the end, like, they do in shows and throw some commercials in or something. But I want to know. I want to know what this thing says. Give us the juice here.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. We don't have those numbers yet. What is today? It's like June. I don't know. What is today? Late June.
27th.
June 27th. We don't have the numbers yet. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is still in the process of analyzing that data, compiling the reports. My understanding, and typically what we see is that report released in mid to late August.
Okay.
So we don't know. We don't have the numbers yet. We actually spoke with the director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a couple of weeks ago, and I asked her if Director Martha Williams, if she had any insights that she could share. And of course, she didn't. Not even the director knows how those numbers are being, how they're looking right now from a numerical standpoint. What I can do is tell you what we have heard from our pilot biologist reports. One of the reasons that I connected with Fred Rutker on the Ducks Unlimited podcast a few weeks back was to get his report on what he was seeing. He joined us from Fort Chipewyan in northern Alberta, which was pretty cool to be talking with him kind of midway through the survey. And there's also some U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot blogs. There's some places where you can go online and find their reports. Some of them are very detailed. And so what I can try to do is summarize what I've gleaned from that and from observations of our biologists as well. In a nutshell, kind of bullet point, I'll say habitat conditions in the Dakotas, much better than last year. Whenever we started this year, 2022, it was looking grim. Last year was super dry. We know there was very little duck production in the prairies last year, anywhere on the prairies, very little. And we didn't have a whole lot of relief in terms of moisture between the end of last fall and kind of late winter this year. So it was looking grim again. But then we had a series of storms, Colorado lows, I believe they were, that came up through the mid-continent and fundamentally changed habitat conditions there in the Dakotas, lifted the Dakotas out of the drought. Eastern Montana remained dry. Southwestern, really all of southern Manitoba was just inundated with water. We had localized flooding. Pond conditions were excellent. That relief, much needed precipitation relief, extended into eastern and southeastern Saskatchewan, which is always good to hear if you're a lover of prairie ducks, whether it be dabblers or divers. The one province that you really have your eye on is Saskatchewan. That's the heart of it all in terms of prairie duck production. Alberta, Manitoba produce their fair share, but Saskatchewan is really the ones you want to see looking good. So eastern Saskatchewan started to improve substantially. And a lot of the important thing is that improvement happened early enough so that ducks could settle and take advantage of it. We saw a late spring. It was cold up there in the Dakotas, so that kind of delayed some of the nesting, meaning that ducks that ultimately did settle in the prairies were able to take advantage of that new precipitation. It stayed dry, however, in southern Alberta, western Saskatchewan, and those areas probably did not see a high degree of settling of waterfowl. And when I say settling, basically you got to think about these birds that are migrating back north, and they're making decisions they're looking at this landscape and making decisions based on where they're gonna stop, where they're gonna try to nest and raise a brood and produce young. And so they use a whole host of things to make that decision. One of the most important being how much water are they seeing down there on the landscape. And Alberta, southern Alberta, southwestern, western Saskatchewan were still pretty dry as birds were settling north. So we don't think we had a lot of birds. We'd be surprised if the counts tell us there are a lot of ducks in that landscape. So the other, I guess what I would close out in terms of habitat conditions as we've heard about it is that the boreal forest was yet again good to excellent. It's a much more stable environment in terms of wetland conditions than the prairies. Alaska, I think, was pretty good. Eastern boreal forest was pretty good. Great Lakes, they're variable as you move across that landscape, but overall average to good. So then the other part of this big equation is, what did the duck population itself look like? You can have outstanding duck habitat up there, but if you don't have a lot of ducks returning in the spring to take advantage of it, production for those individuals that do return will be great. But if you don't start, you can kind of think about it investing money. If you don't start with a huge principal, it's going to take you a while to see that investment grow back to high levels. And we think that's kind of where we were this spring. After several years of pretty dry conditions on the prairies, we had been seeing duck counts. If you go back to when we still had the numbers, the duck counts were starting to drop off. And last year, we know it was super dry, did not produce a lot of ducks in the prairies last year. So I don't think any of our biologists were expecting a real large spring breeding population to be going back north. So I think what we heard from some of the pilots, from some of our folks on the ground, is that there seemed to be a lot of unoccupied ponds. In other words, good-looking pond conditions, good-looking ponds, but not many ducks on them. And that would be my expectation when the numbers come out in August, is that we would see an average, I might even say above average pond count, when you look across the entire prairie landscape, because the ponds are only counted in the prairies. The survey's flown all over that northern landscape, but they only count ponds on the prairies. I would expect an average to above average pond count, but a below average spring breeding population size. So That's what I expect. Now, I haven't told you what those two things may mean for our, the birds that we see coming south. We'll get to that in a second, but I want to stop and give you all a chance to ask me anything that I might have missed or
Well,
misspoken about there.
yeah, you touched on it, Mike, but I know several biologists who I talked to a lot who were very concerned, back this last winter and even back in the last summer when they were looking at the modeling and we're continuing on with liberal seasons. They're like, man, it's too dry up there. It's getting worse and worse. Yeah. And I don't trust these numbers. And obviously all U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service could do is model and try to work from it. But man, when that moisture came, I read some of the reports of the guys flying the transects, and you could tell they were excited to see that. And some of it obviously won't pay off until next year when some of that habitat had dried out. And let's talk about that a little bit as far as the farmers being able to get in there on some of these seasonal potholes, and they were tilling them up. And we all understand they're there to make a living too. So, but if you could talk about that, and then also we'll get into what it really means down south, because even though there aren't as many ducks breeding as you would hope, it's still a big positive for us.
It is. Yeah. So we've talked, anytime we have drought the way we did last year, and really the year before that, when we kind of saw things unfolding, it gave us an opportunity to talk about drought as at least in the prairies, as a natural part of that prairie cycle. Now, the other thing that we had last year, and it's continuing into this year, is drought in the western U.S., and that is sort of a different beast, entirely driven by declining snowpack, climate changes, and the implications for that are going to be, an entirely different discussion. That's something that Ducks Unlimited and a lot of our partners are focused on. But when we talk about prairie drought, we had the opportunity last year to talk about how it's a necessary part of that prairie cycle, because as a wetland stays inundated for year after year after year, it begins to lose its productivity related to some biogeochemistry things and detrital food chain kind of discussions. We won't get into a lot of that, but basically what you need to happen every now and then on those prairie breeding grounds is for those wetlands to dry up. You don't need them to dry up for very long. One summer should be enough, because what happens is that when it stays wet for too long, you get a lot of organic material that accumulates and it doesn't decay as well. And organic material, we're just talking vegetation. There's a lot of nutrients bound up in that vegetation. And under flooded conditions, it doesn't recycle. You don't recycle those nutrients as efficiently. And so what you need occasionally is for them to dry out and expose all that dead vegetation and other organic material to the oxygen, which accelerates that decomposition process. That recycling of nutrients goes back into the vegetation. And then once you get all that newly growing vegetation, once it refloods, it just explodes with invertebrates and all sorts of other food sources for waterfowl. And so it's this kind of recycling of nutrients that a drought is good for. Now, to your point, Bill, the unfortunate thing that comes with drought is that it gives landowners, producers, the temptation and the opportunity to either drain those wetlands or to disc those wetlands up. Now, as long as what we really don't like to see, and what has a long-term permanent negative effect on the capacity of that landscape to produce ducks, which is what all duck hunters care about, is our ability to produce ducks. What's bad for that is permanent wetland drainage. When you take a wetland basin and reduce its ability to hold water, you've lost duck habitat. You've lost potential duck production. It's that simple. Now, if a farmer goes in there and just tills it up, plants it when it's dry, but doesn't drain it, that's okay. It wasn't going to hold water that year anyway. And, I can't really speak to the implications of disking and growing a crop on it, in terms of its productivity once it refloods. But the important thing is that we keep that basin intact and allow it to hold water once that precipitation returns. So there's a couple of things that we see whenever drought occurs in terms of those land use decisions. And some places we see more severe impacts than others. And that's why a lot of the voluntary incentive-based easement programs that Ducks Unlimited, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a lot of our other partners are putting in place up there on the prairies are so important. It's retaining those intact basins and preventing them from being drained. But we do that only at those programs are voluntary and they're incentive based, and that we look for those kind of compatible solutions. But it's we did see some of that. Some landscapes, like I said, are a little more under threat than others.
Well, and then you don't have the vegetation around them after they've been disced up, and also that takes a year to catch back up. But duck hunters who are as old as me will remember the late 80s and early 90s when we had a 30-day season and 3 duck limit in the Mississippi Flyway, and times were bleak. I mean, we had some great hunting at times, but the number of ducks really was poor. And then all of a sudden, bam, those rains came. And was it 94 when we first started increasing 94 or 95, we started increasing limits. And it was just amazing. It was night and day within 2 years when the rains came.
Yeah, I think it's 95. I forget exactly when it became it became official policy, and then it might have been in 95, I think, and then maybe 96, maybe 95, 96, whenever the first regulations were put in place. But anyway, around that time.
Yeah.
Yep.
Howdy, listeners. For more great content, check out NWF Outdoors social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Connect with us. We want to hear from you. Send us your ideas for podcast guests and questions in the comments.
And for even more excellent content, here's a message from our partner podcast.
Hey everyone, this is Marcia Brownlee from Artemis Sportswomen. We know you love awesome stories about hunting, fishing, and conservation, so head on over to the Artemis podcast. You'll meet adventurous, accomplished women who are redefining conservation through their lives in the field and on the water. Filled with humor, audacity, empathy, and intelligence, Artemis brings you new voices and introduces you to women from all walks of the sporting community. Find Artemis wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, Mike, this year, not having done this count the last couple of years, I mean, did you guys have kind of a special set of questions where you're like, let's kind of look at this a little differently because did you rely more on anecdotal stuff these past couple of years? What was the approach this year, not having had the count the last couple of years?
That question gives me an opportunity to talk about something that I get. People ask me fairly often. It's like, is there a certain time of year, whenever I tell them what I do, or I'm talking to them, even some of my friends, a certain time of year will roll around. They say, I bet this is a pretty busy time for y'all. There's not, outside of some of our researchers that are geared around, have a lot of their activities geared around field season, most of us don't have a tremendous amount of fluctuation over the course of the year in terms of our workload in response to this type of survey. Now, that's certainly not the case for folks like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which are the ones conducting and managing this. But from a Ducks Unlimited perspective, habitat conservation is a long game. The challenges are, they don't go away in August. They don't go away in January. And we can't fix them in 1 year, and we can't fix them in 5 years. And so our job is a long game. Our mission is a long game. And so we make decisions over time frames that span multiple surveys you could think about. So when we see these surveys on an annual basis, Ducks Unlimited as an organization doesn't sit back in anticipation and look at the results and then make some course correction or make some decision in response to 1 year's survey. The type of work that we do doesn't require those annual decisions in response to the results from this survey. So our organization is looking at this. I mean, certainly there's a communication piece that we're interested in. We are a conduit to some of the core constituencies of this waterfowl management community, and duck numbers, duck production is a very important thing to all of members of that community. So we have a role to play in communicating those numbers and trying to sort of say, hey, this is what it might mean for some of the decisions that you will make this fall and winter as you go afield. But from an organization, what we do is keep track of these things, keep track of population trajectories, species population trajectories, keep track of the fluctuations. Well, I shouldn't even say fluctuations, but the longer term trend in pond counts, and use that information to inform our conservation priorities. Are there certain species or certain populations of a certain species that we're starting to see a pattern of decline that would require us or dictate that we start paying more attention to that, or sort of redirect some of our resources to that? And even those solutions are not going to be a 1 or 2 year deal. It's all because in essentially all the cases, the problems that ultimately drive declines or challenges for waterfowl populations are multi-year issues, if not multi-decade issues. And so those solutions require a much longer time frame of observation and decision making. But this survey for us is, it's exciting because we all love ducks and we love to keep track of what's happening. But we didn't go into this necessarily with any additional questions that would influence decisions from an organizational standpoint outside of communication, wanting to help our constituents know what's going on and factor it into their type of interest and decisions.
Can I ask one more question, Bill? I'm sorry. Sure. He gave me an opening because he started talking about these long-term trends, habitat conditions. It's not a 1 year management type of thing. And it brings to mind climate issues. I mean, it really does. And I know, the sporting community has been a little bit loath to talk about that too much, but, part of our work has been talking to hunters and anglers across the country. And, when you start hearing hundreds and hundreds of stories of things changing, it's pretty undoubtedly, an issue. And so I'm curious, when you're thinking about that, I know DU's done some great stuff with regard to climate. When you're thinking about that, how is that playing into these conversations? How are you, when you think about trajectory and you're seeing the warming trends and some of the drought and other stuff, give us a sense of how you bring that in from the scientific, angle.
Well, from our perspective, when we talk about climate change, our core interest is trying to understand what the future is going to look like, what that future landscape is going to look like, what that future habitat is going to look like. And it may not just be precipitation. It may not be a direct effect of any kind of climate change. A lot of these changes that affect duck populations are indirect. Let's think about how climate change enables expansion of certain types of land uses into areas where we didn't previously see certain activities that aren't useful for waterfowl. Just think about the expansion of different crop types farther north. You can also kind of think about the effect of changing climate on water supplies and how that makes it more difficult for certain types of waterfowl-friendly agricultural practices to remain in place. We've seen that I'm thinking about rice, namely in different aspects of rice agriculture, the availability of water and how climate change influences the availability of that water. Maybe not a direct effect of climate on ducks in that particular case, but there's 1 or 2 linkages there where we definitely see that effect. And so what we try to do is work with climate scientists to apply the best understanding possible at any given point in time to figure out what the current challenges are, and then what the trajectory of that challenge will be in the presence of a changing climate. And then what is that going to mean for waterfowl habitats or waterfowl populations? And then what type of conservation programs can we promote that will mitigate those effects, whether it be an alternative type of land use, an alternative, and some of which sometimes there aren't great answers for that. When you're thinking about an alternative to rice agriculture, That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I had somebody ask that question to me a couple of weeks ago. It's like, well, if we continue to see declining water availability for rice agriculture in some of these landscapes, is there a substitute crop that's going to take the place of that? Man, it's tough to come up with a good one because you got to think about what rice provides. Number one, it provides that infrastructure to hold water. Name another crop outside of crawfish, which goes hand in hand with rice. Name another crop that allows you or that requires that infrastructure to hold water. There's not one that comes to mind very easily. So there's that issue. There's also using the best available scientific, climate science to project out those future precipitation patterns and thinking about what it's going to look like for these prairie wetland cycles. And interestingly, while some of the climate models will show, and I say some of them because I'm not as familiar with all of them, but I think it's generally accepted that climate models out west are predicting less snowpack. It's pretty easy read on what declining snowpack levels is going to mean for water availability in the western U.S., water availability for wetland management, water availability for rice production. That's pretty easy to imagine that. But some of the more recent climate models for the prairies, as I understand them, kind of project differences across that landscape in terms of what precipitation patterns might do. And I forget exactly how it's going to go. I think maybe they might project it could be wetter in the eastern portion of the prairie landscape and maybe drier in the western. So it's not necessarily that we can just simply say, oh, climate change is going to mean fewer inundated potholes every year up on the prairies. It may not. And our climate science is imperfect. That's the other thing, is that you gotta, anytime you're making a decision based on some of these climate models, you got to realize there's a component of uncertainty with it. And so you just have to keep that in mind when you are trying to develop new programs or adapt existing programs that will be resilient, will still provide values under a range of future climate conditions, I guess is the way I would define resiliency. It's not easy. That's for sure.
You're touching on things I love. I'm going to jump in one more time, Bill, sorry. And then I'll let you take us home, because one of the things we've been really pushing a lot, Mike, is natural infrastructure, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that the waterfowl community is in such a good spot because they have one of the coolest tools that's ever existed for natural infrastructure and having the NACA program, right? And, we're really pushing just recently here, we're going to see I think today, we're going to see a bill introduced that's modeled after NACA for grasslands, right? Natural infrastructure creates a couple things. A, it creates resilience, as you just talked about. And then B, habitat equals opportunity for the sporting community, for ducks, for everything. And we're literally creating habitat. And I think anytime I talk to a waterfowl person, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that program and what it means and how we get to utilize that. And then if we can replicate that to some degree for grasslands, what that will mean even for waterfowl as well. Maybe you can speak to that a little, and then I'll let you take us home after that, Bill, because I keep jumping the gun here.
Well, NACA, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, has been one of the most important pieces of legislation of my career, and I've been I guess in this field dating back to grad school for close to 25, even maybe 30 years, and so NACA is I mean, it's kind of difficult to think about how to describe it in terms of its importance. Has been one of the signature pieces of legislation to benefit waterfowl populations and other wetland dependent wildlife of our times. So, but the other thing that I try to do is when we talk about NACA in the context of continental waterfowl populations, I try to remind folks that, just as you're alluding to here, Aaron, with the need for this other conservation grassland, sort of a grassland equivalent to NACA, NACA's not the only answer. NACA is, if we took away everything else and we're left only with NACA, we'd lose this battle. We'd lose this battle for waterfowl. We'd lose it for all other grassland birds. Our solutions, long-term solutions for conservation, require NACA, but they require key components of the U.S. Farm Bill, conservation title of the Farm Bill. We can't, as conservationists, forget about that. That's coming up for renew here, I think, next year. That is absolutely foundational to the recovery of so many wildlife populations across the U.S. here over the past 30, 40 years. But even with that, I mean, there's still a great need for additional measures, additional programs that offer those voluntary incentive-based solutions. And it can be, and it has to be win-win for wildlife and for people. And that includes the landowners themselves. It also includes the people that derive benefits from those lands that may not be the landowner. It's just that landowner is producing something that you as an adjacent neighbor, in the case of migratory birds, migratory waterfowl, thousands of miles away are going to benefit from in some way or another. And so, it takes a whole army of people, a whole army of pieces of legislation at the state and federal level. Another one, I don't know if y'all have talked about it, is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. That's one that
we talk about that a little bit. Yeah.
Making its way through Congress. Hopefully we can get that across the finish line. Of course, y'all also, I know, talked about the Return Act here and what, the shocking kind of nature of that, and how it would be so detrimental to an incredibly valuable piece of legislation that provides funds that has to be the envy of the world, So it's like, hey, we need these new things. We need to hang on to the ones that we've got, but it takes a whole package to do the type of conservation work amid all the different threats that we have. And within Ducks Unlimited, we feel we have a tremendous opportunity to leverage the value of wetland conservation beyond just waterfowl habitat right now. There's this massive movement right now across the world, and certainly across North America, for people recognizing and wanting to cash in. I shouldn't say cash in from a financial standpoint, but I'm talking about wanting to benefit from all these other values, recognizing all these other values from wetlands conservation that wetlands provide, whether it be flood risk reduction, whether it be carbon sequestration in terms of climate mitigation, whether it be clean water, reducing algal blooms in the Great Lakes. I mean, there is a movement right now, people recognizing those values, and that in itself is another tool in this toolbox where we can attract new partners, corporate partners, around their sustainability goals. And it's an exciting time, and I find myself now rambling a little bit here, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing when you can ramble about opportunities that you have,
Yes, it is.
And seeing broader society recognize benefits of having intact wetlands. They don't have to be seen as swamplands and wastelands anymore. They're some of the most productive and socially rich pieces of this landscape. We just kind of have to figure out how to make them work in the context of everything else that we need from this land.
Yeah, we spent a century trying to get rid of all of them we could. So It's taken some time and effort to get things back in order. I'm going to make a comment. It's based on one of my pet peeves, and then I have a couple of questions I think you can string together to wrap us up. My comment is for listeners. Every year when somebody has a bad duck season, I see them say, Ducks Unlimited lied to us about ducks. Ducks Unlimited, folks, doesn't actually do duck counts. That is the Fish and Wildlife Service. DU just takes that data, and they're great communications folks over at DU. They put that data out for hunters. So that's enough of that. But real quickly, all this new water, understanding we didn't have as many ducks as any of us would like going north in the spring, but with fresh water, fresh habitat, what does that generally mean for the productivity of waterfowl, their nesting success? And then if you're willing to go there, if you were sitting around with your buddies drinking a beer and having just read some of the reports. They aren't concise and no duck numbers, but reports of the folks who actually did the transects. What do you think it means in different parts of the country for duck season? And you don't have to get detailed on that, just a general idea.
Yeah. So I appreciate that, Bill. And so let's see, what do I want to say first here? I guess in terms of, my mind is going several different places here, because you mentioned, what was the first thing that you were saying? Kind of help me out.
How does all this new habitat translate to nest success?
Well, so recognizing that we had, as I described, we expect fewer ducks to have been going back north. We expect those birds to have encountered much better habitat. We know that to be true. And that's going to mean those birds that did get there are going to have higher production rate. They're going to produce more young per individual. There's going to be more renesting opportunities. There's also some things we could talk about. If you go back to last year, drought doesn't just affect ducks. It affects the things that eat ducks and ducklings and duck eggs as well. And so predators probably had lower output last year. And so maybe there's fewer predators out there this year. Who knows if, exactly what that number is going to, if we had that number, what it would look like. But so maybe that also gives a little bit of a boost to the survival of some of those nests and ducklings. And so we would expect higher production in terms of sort of per individual. If you look at like per nesting hen, we would expect them to be producing more birds than we've seen the past few years. That's a good thing, because any seasoned hunter, it doesn't actually take you very long to figure this out. Young birds are the ones that you want to see a lot of when you're out in the field. And you don't get a lot of young birds if you don't have a lot of production. So this year we will definitely, I feel safe saying we will have more young birds in the population this fall than we did last year. That's going to be a good thing for southern hunters. And right now I'm kind of mentally thinking about the Mississippi and Central Flyway, because I'm mainly talking about some improvements in the prairies. I'm going to talk about the Pacific Atlantic Flyway here in a moment. So yeah, I'm more optimistic about this year than what we saw last year. It's not going to be a record year. I certainly would not expect that, because we didn't have a large breeding population up there cranking out ducks. But we should expect more young birds to be available in the fall flight. Now, how far those birds come south, where they settle, when they settle in those areas depends on a whole host of factors related to the availability of habitat as fall and winter progresses throughout those entire flyways. It depends on the severity and timing of winter weather. Depends on things at a local scale from you as an individual hunter. Depends on what your landscape looks like within, I don't know, let's say a 15 or 20 mile radius around your area. It's also going to depend on conditions at a larger scale. And you can have not enough habitat to attract ducks. You can have too much habitat that will spread out the ducks that do make it to your general location. So there's a lot of things that are going to influence and always do influence ultimate hunting success. But I'm optimistic about what we're going to see in the Central Mississippi Flyway this year in terms of more young birds settling, or more young birds traveling south, especially among some of those prairie nesters like blue-winged teal, pintails, mallards, shovelers, gadwall. I would expect them to have done pretty well this year, and we'll see. I guess I forgot about this. North Dakota Game and Fish did release their survey from their state earlier this year, and they found kind of what I described earlier: a higher than average pond count, but a duck count that I think was definitely higher than last year, but it did not recover as much as what pond numbers did. So that would be consistent with this idea of maybe there's more habitat up there this year than we have ducks to kind of fill it up. So, but yeah, I think it's good to be optimistic in the Mississippi and Central Flyways. I'll take a jaunt out to the Pacific Flyway here for a minute. And so you're going to be looking at production in Alberta, British Columbia, Alaska, And then those local western states are the primary source of the birds that you're going to be focusing on. Certainly in California, Intermountain West, gripped by intense drought, we expect very little local production from those areas. And that's important because a non-trivial amount of the duck production for those hunters in those states kind of comes from those local areas. There's not going to be a whole lot of production from those local states, local areas this year. Conditions in Alaska, I would expect to be good. So you're going to get some steady production out of that. We talked about Alberta being dry, so I don't think you should expect a lot of prairie production to be making its way into the Pacific Flyway this year. Pacific Flyway hunters, I think your biggest challenge is going to be, do you have the water to hunt? Not so much the ducks that you're going to have available coming down the Flyway, but for a lot of folks, the much bigger concern is whether you've even got water to hunt over and to attract ducks in. And that's, of course, related to that western drought. Some of the coastal areas out west may be some beneficiaries of what we're seeing in terms of the drought. But as we saw last year, things can change in a hurry in terms of those, certainly in the Central Valley and some of those other landscapes. So you get a good precipitation event, it can fundamentally change the amount of habitat that's available out there. So can't necessarily say that about the Klamath Basin, because I think the story's already been written in terms of the amount of habitat that's going to be available in those areas this fall. That's a snowpack-driven landscape, and there's very little, if any, water going to be available for some of those two iconic refuges in that particular area, Tule Lake and Lower Klamath. That's another story in its entirety. You get into the Atlantic Flyway, and you're looking at birds produced from Great Lakes, the eastern Canada and eastern U.S., and maybe some prairie birds some prairie birds make their way over there, so they'll benefit from that greater prairie production. And then, of course, the other breeding regions of importance to the Atlantic Flyway is that eastern Canadian boreal forest, and that's a pretty stable area. So average, maybe a bump up in terms of the availability of young birds coming from the prairie. So I mean, it's definitely a reason to be more optimistic this year than last year. And we just kind of have to hope all the other pieces fall into place to kind of make it happen for us.
Like any good scientist, Mike, a lot of qualifiers, but but optimism in the end. So that's the thing that matters.
Yeah. One thing, if I could, there's a couple of things that I want to close out with here, at least from my end. You guys let me know if you have any other questions. But the first thing that I will say, a lot of people don't know about this. We've talked a lot about the waterfowl, this breeding population habitat survey. There is a place online where people can go to look at hundreds of photos. Actually, there's thousands. I'm looking at the number right here. Thousands of photos that our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologists and their observers have taken over the years, and they are publicly available for viewing. It's on Flickr, Flickr. It is an account labeled Pilot Biologist. It's run by our federal pilots, our pilot biologists, and our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employees. These are in the public domain. They are out there for people to view. They are out there for people to download, to use if they want to. You can, and they've done a tremendous job organizing these photos by year and by survey location. If you're curious to see what habitat in the Northwest Territories looks like, if you're curious to see some of what they encounter, go there and see them. And you'll even find some photos of some of these biologists catching a few fish or two. And we talked with Fred about that on that episode, because what happens is those pilot biologists have to use these very remote locations, and they're pilots. Their activities are regulated kind of by what they're allowed to do, how much time they're allowed to fly over a certain period of time, how much they're allowed. Yeah. And so they have to take breaks periodically. And so some of those days they find themselves either weathered out, they find themselves having to take a day off, and they get all their transcription done. And then later in the evening, heck, what would any good outdoors person do? They would avail themselves to the to the opportunities there. And so there's a little bit of that observation and experience that they get to enjoy as well. But it's a fantastic resource in terms of seeing habitat, seeing the work they do, seeing the men and women that do this work. And so that's on Flickr. That is just Pilot Biologist, and there's even some pictures there from this year. It's just a tremendous resource.
We'll add that to the show notes. Yeah, that's a good resource.
The other thing, Bill, that I know we wanted to talk about here, just make people aware of. So one of the other things that I do in my position now is I serve as co-host of the Ducks Unlimited podcast, and Ducks Unlimited here in the States and Ducks Unlimited Canada will be teaming up next month to do a live stream of like as soon as we can after the release of this report that we've been talking about, so we can dig into that report and just have a conversation about it. I'm going to be part of that. We'll have a waterfowl biologist from DU Canada on there, Fred Rutker, the guy that we've just talked about, that pilot biologist. He's going to participate, and Jim Ronquist is going to be on there as well. So we're going to have 4 people talking about this from all different aspects. Some of the things that we've talked about here in terms of the survey and what it is and how it's conducted will be discussed, but we'll get into the numbers, both in terms of ponds, duck numbers, goose numbers that are available in that report. We don't have a date on that yet. It's probably going to be that 3rd or 4th week of August, but we'll try to, we're going to be doing a lot of promotion through our Ducks Unlimited channel, so people can keep an eye out for that. If you want to know the numbers, hear us discuss them as soon as possible after that report is released, keep an eye out for that. And I can forward you that invitation once it's available.
Please do. I look forward to it.
Yeah, please do. And any links you want us to include, Mike, in our show notes. And I'll try to take us home here. I've been fascinated by this conversation. For a layperson who doesn't hunt many ducks, I get to a time or two a year, but not like y'all who are sitting in the center of duck mecca over there. But just fascinating, the science, the social aspects, all the different climate variables. There's just so much going on here. I think we could have this conversation for a really long time, but we'll try to wrap it up. Mike, any other wise words you want to leave us with? Any take-home messages that can be said in 1 or 2 sentences that folks really ought to leave with?
I would say get ready. The waterfowl hunting season is going to be here before you know it. We're going to have one this year. We're going to have throughout most of the areas. It's going to be liberal seasons again. So avail yourself to the opportunity and get out there and take somebody with you.
That's what people wanted to hear. So nice way to leave us. Bill, what about you? Take us home from your end, buddy.
Hey, yeah, this has been a fun conversation because we're not necessarily talking about legislation and people needing to call. So I'm just going to say for my friends in the southern Mississippi flyway where I am, let's pray for good water conditions this fall and a lot of November and December cold fronts. We don't need them in January. We need November and December cold fronts. That's right. Let's all get together in our prayer groups on that. How about you, Aaron?
Agreed.
Well, I'll just say I won't let you quite off the hook with the legislation. We talked about a couple of things here that we need the sportsmen and women to get active on, right? Like clearly that's what we do. There's the Return Act, as Mike mentioned, trying to repeal lots of the Pittman-Robertson Act just would be terrible for conservation. We have the Recovering America's Wildlife Act out there. We've got to get that across the finish line. A lot of habitat improvement and work could be done with that. We have this North American Grasslands Act now, Grasslands Conservation Act. The sporting community has an amazing history, as we know, of being those dedicated conservationists, and we just can't let up. We need your voices. We need you guys in these congressional offices. We need you at Wildlife Commission meetings. We need you at DU meetings, TU meetings, all of these things. So get engaged, stay engaged, and look for Mike and people like him. Look for his words to help guide you on how you want to advocate, but get engaged. And with that, we'll sign off, gentlemen. Appreciate your time, Mike, and we'll see you next time, Bill.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys. Thank you guys so much for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it.
For more great content, check out NWF Outdoors social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Connect with us. We want to hear from you. Send us your ideas for podcast guests and questions in the comments.
We are NWF Outdoors.